Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Slip Safety Show. I'm Christian Harris and I'm the founder of Slip Safety Services. My guest today is Dave Lovell from DSL Consulting. This is a really interesting conversation, and I think it's a topic that many people may have heard about but don't have that much detailed knowledge of, and it's called primary authority partnerships. Dave, I wanted to get on the show because he basically has been involved in this way of working with local authorities for the last decade plus, in fact, since its inception. And he was overseeing the whole scheme for a couple of years as well before he left the public servant life and set up his own consulting business, which, of course, he'll tell us about in our chat. There are all sorts of benefits of having a primary authority relationship with a local authority partner, and we set out what those are within the conversation and give some examples of certain events happening and what that means whether you've got a primary authority partnership or not. I think this is required viewing or listening for anybody that's managing risk within a business, and I think you really should be considering taking this approach because there are all sorts of very tangible benefits to it. So with that, let's get into the conversation with Dave. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get some value from it. And if you do, we would very much welcome any likes, comments and subscribes on our YouTube channel. And of course, tell any friends that might be interested in this episode or others about the show as well. So here we go with Dave Lovell of DSL Consulting. Dave Lovell, welcome to the Slip Safety Show.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Good to see you on a nice sunny day in the middle of lockdown. All good fun.
Well, I'm looking out of a window in Manchester, and it's not very sunny, I'm afraid. It's
Right. Well,
Manchester weather.
Well,
plenty of drizzle.
One of my clients in the cleaning industry, she's based in Manchester, and whenever she calls me or I call her, it seems to be the case that wherever I am in the country, and I live in London, but I'm often travelling around, it's quite sunny, and wherever she is, which is often in Manchester, it's normally raining. So we have this kind of little joke where the first thing we talk about is the weather. So any days that it's raining for me, she's always overjoyed that I'm suffering from the rain as well.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but there we go. Do you want to give people a quick overview of kind of who you are and your background and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So as you've heard, I live in Manchester, the north of the country. My sort of first career was in trading standards. Worked in trading standards for a number of years. Realised that that wasn't quite going to be a career for life, so I joined what was the Better Regulation Delivery Office at the time. That was the name of the organisation. It's now the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And I would say my career has mainly been around better regulation initiatives. So I've been very much at the soft end of being a regulator, more about advising businesses how to comply with the law rather than potentially getting pleasure out of taking enforcement action.
Yeah.
So when I worked at BRDO, I got involved heavily in the primary authority scheme. I was involved in training and more at the sort of engagement side of the scheme. So I work with businesses extensively, work with enforcement authorities, and to a certain degree work with the primary authorities themselves. So worked with them for a number of years, did some other roles within the organisation. At probably the last 2 years of working there, I headed up the whole programme. So I had a helicopter view of the scheme. In the last 12 months, I've set up my own consultancy business. I think, again, I took a view that being a civil servant wasn't necessarily something I wanted to do for the next 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
So I had a eureka moment and decided that actually I'd become a consultant and actually help businesses set up primary authorities and ultimately get the most out of the scheme, and ultimately there's opportunities there for consultants, and it's fairly niche with regards to the knowing the level of detail that someone like myself would be. So to that end, there isn't too much competition in this particular space.
Yeah, and certainly nobody. Well, I say nobody in a bit of a blasé way, but probably nobody that's got your depth of experience, having been involved with it at such a high level as well. So that's got to be beneficial. So for those that don't know what it is, I mean, I wanted to have this conversation because I've seen the benefits of a primary authority scheme over my years working in health and safety. So, but for people that don't know what it is, because obviously I didn't know what it was until I heard about it. Do you want to just give an overview of kind of what it means and how it works?
Yeah. So it's been around quite a number of years. It came about on the back of the Hampton Review, which is nearly 20 years ago. So anyone involved in that at the time, that's quite a worry. That was 20 years ago when that was written. But generally speaking, from an outcomes point of view, businesses were concerned that regulators were putting unnecessary burdens on businesses. They were concerned about inconsistent advice. They were concerned about duplication. They were concerned about single point of contact, etc., etc. So as a result, the primary authority scheme was brought in. That was about just over 10 years ago. And effectively, it's a legal partnership between the business and effectively the local authority. So you're looking really at primarily trading standards, environmental health, licensing, and fire safety. So ultimately, it's a legal partnership that is nominated by the Secretary of State for BAYS, and the key benefit really is around the assured advice. So businesses want assurance that their products or their procedures are robust, and ultimately they then work with the primary authority who issue what's called assured advice. So the key benefit of the assured advice, rather than taking advice from the likes of myself, a consultant or a law firm, is ultimately there's an opportunity to block enforcement action via the primary authority register, and ultimately block enforcement action by enforcement authorities. So it's a game changer in that respect, that ultimately the business can get the assured advice, and ultimately it knows it can go about its business. And ultimately, having worked for myself for the last 12 months, generally speaking, the CEOs don't really understand regulation, don't really want to get involved in the sort of day-to-day stuff, haven't got the bandwidth to do it, and ultimately this gives them the assurance that what they're doing is robust, and ultimately gives them assurance and gives them credibility that they take regulation seriously.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, obviously in my world of slips and falls, where I came across this was with corporate clients that had buildings across the country, and what they were finding was, if they had somebody slip over in a kitchen or a poolside or wherever in Newcastle, the way that was dealt with and investigated by an environmental health officer there would be very different to the way it was dealt with and investigated in London or in Birmingham or whatever it might be. And so the benefit that, as you say, that they would see is that firstly they're getting the advice kind of validated by a local authority, so it has a lot of credence to what their policies are, but also that they, as I understand it, if you've got your partnership with Westminster, let's say, because I know they do these, the environmental health officer in Newcastle, for example, they can't be asking you loads of questions and looking at it in their particular way. They have to kind of defer to what you've agreed with Westminster. Is that kind of right?
And that's correct, yeah. And going back 10 years ago, that was quite a challenge. So typically, again, we'll keep using the examples you've given. The officer in Newcastle wouldn't be comfortable with that. They'd think, this is my local authority, this is my patch. Ultimately, that opinion and that narrative has changed, that ultimately the selling point from a Newcastle point of view is ultimately these businesses are low risk because of the reasons we've just said. They've got assured advice, and actually if you want to find the problem premises in Newcastle, there'll be plenty knocking around, and I'm sure in your business you'll come across that, where there's there's plenty of gyms or leisure centre. There's plenty of high risk areas that those authorities would be better placed, and that narrative has got stronger over time, and those enforcement authorities accept that actually is a benefit for them as well, that they can target the resources in the right place.
Yeah, particularly I suppose in the years of austerity that we've had, where proactive investigation is I wouldn't say non-existent, but it's a lot lower than it was 10 years ago, isn't it?
And that's I'm still in regular dialogue with people working in a local authority setting, but I think that is a consistent theme, and likewise you're speaking to these individuals as well. There is a challenge. I suppose ultimately there is a benefit with regards to PA, that they can cost recover. So the more savvy PAs have realised this, and ultimately they use it as an opportunity to provide a resilient service. So in the UK, there's about 170 providers. So that's obviously increased over the 10 years. So the more savvy ones have realised that there's an opportunity from the cost recovery aspect of the scheme, and ultimately they provide a resilient service. So again, from a business point of view, that they know that if their regular officer is, well, they won't be doing it at the moment, but if they were off 2 weeks in the Bahamas, then when they put that call in and they need urgent advice, that ultimately the service is resilient and there'll be someone else to deal with their inquiries. And again, having spoken to a lot of businesses in the last 12 months, that's something that they really value, that ultimately they've got a service, they've got a PA partner that it is ultimately resilient.
Yeah. So how many, if there's 170 doing it, what sort of percentage is that of I should probably know this general knowledge, but
it's about a third.
About a third. Okay.
It's about a third. And again, when I worked at the office, that ultimately I don't think the office are particularly fussy about that particular number, as long as each time a business comes to want a partnership, the answer is, this is my criteria, and they find a partner. If they come with their criteria and can't find a partner, then that's clearly a problem. And in that respect, the office need to do something to solve that particular issue. But again, in my time working at the office, that wasn't a particular problem. And I suppose ultimately, you'd rather have 20 organisations that are providing a quality service rather than 170, where some of them are potentially scratchy.
Yeah, because some of the authorities seem to have I don't know if a better reputation, or if they're just doing more of it, or they're just more prominently doing it. But some of them do seem to have kind of taken the bull by the horns more than others. So that of the 170, there might be, as you say, 20 that are doing a lot more, a big proportion of the total.
Yeah, and again, I found that as part of my sort of role as a consultant, I would look to find a partner for the business. So, had a discussion: is PA suitable for you? Yes, it is. What is your criteria? What do you value? Is it cost? Is it geography, etc., etc.? I go through that conversation. Generally speaking, I've been quite surprised that the PAs are chomping at the bit. So once you engage with them and say, I've got this particular business, it's a small chain of restaurants in the northeast or whatever, would you like to have a conversation with them? The answer is unanimously, yes, we would like a conversation. So they become, again, over time, over the 10 years, they become more commercial. So they see it as an opportunity to bring in more expertise, potentially more income via cost recovery.
Yeah, yeah. And when there's let's say, going back to my example, somebody's got a partnership with Westminster and there's an incident in Newcastle, does that also mean that that incident would be investigated by the Westminster people and therefore they're charging for that? So that's an income stream as well, or does it not work like that?
No, not as a general rule. So Newcastle would do their investigation, and they would ultimately then have a conversation with Westminster. Again, I think it's fair to say there's a whole host of conversations and times where Newcastle would do an investigation and actually Westminster would say, we haven't considered that, we've never had that conversation with the business, we can't block the enforcement action. So again, it's a northern phrase, but fill your boots, get on with it, tell us what's happened. So I think it's worth saying, again, just from a context point of view, there's been very few examples of disputes over the years. So the numbers are small. Funnily enough, you mentioned Newcastle. That's one of the ones with regards to Newcastle and Hull and Greggs. There was another case with McDonald's. There was another case with Tesco, but the numbers are relatively small. So if you think that the scheme's got over 100,000 businesses, there's 170,000 PAs, 170 PAs. The numbers of what are called determinations are relatively small. So again, that was a concern 10 years ago. Oh, there's going to be all these legal determinations left, right, and centre, and that never materialised. And really, it hasn't done because the PA just has a sensible conversation. So Westminster have a sensible conversation with Newcastle and say, how can we resolve this? Certain circumstances, the business gets involved, etc., etc.
And that probably helps to de-escalate things as well, because if you're talking as a enforcement officer for one council to another, rather than speaking to a client, you're on that equal footing, aren't you? And you've got that respect. I mean, of course, you've got respect for the client as well, but it's a different. You've got that camaraderie, and you can probably have these conversations and solve any issues that were to arise.
Yeah. And again, generally speaking, whether you work in the trade and standards profession or environmental health or the fire, you've got there is a large amount of respect that goes across the piece. Again, from a business point of view, you would never entertain having the conversation directly with the EA. So clearly, having the PA that's doing the having the conversation on your behalf, if you get invited into the conversation, you'd be a lot more comfortable that you've got your PA by your side, just in case it gets contentious or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So the people watching or listening to this are most likely going to be interested in the health and safety element of this, or maybe the fire rather than the product side. So with that kind of context, what sorts of things can you have assured advice on? So what types of activities or policies or whatever it might be can you have this kind of protection of PA for?
So anything really in the health and safety space that is enforced at a local authority level. I think that's useful to just make that particular point that there are circumstances where it's enforced by the health and safety executive.
Yeah.
They have got a role as what's called a supporting regulator. But generally speaking, to answer your question, if you've got a slips, trips and fall procedure, for example, that could be assured. The whole procedure could be assured by your PA. Now that would take a bit longer. So from a resource point of view, the expectation would be that the PA would sit down with the business, they'd do a desktop review. They might want to look at your audits in some detail. They might want to go and sit in a training session. So that would typically take quite a while. The other thing would be there'd be certain circumstances where you would just ask fairly short, definitive questions. Really, a legal, there's a legal answer to it, and you want clarity on a particular thing. So I don't know, it might be about the depth of the swimming pool or the amount of lifeguards that you need on. If it's a certain size, so that it's very very specific. all I would do in that space is really encourage businesses to ask the question of the PA. So there's never a daft question. You should be pushing and this is where I've found I've been quite useful for working businesses, that actually you should be challenging your PA to say, this is my question. Can you answer it? And sometimes if the answer's no, you might need to go back to them again and say, you're absolutely certain.
Yeah. And obviously, any enforcement by local authority is would come under kind of criminal law, whereas an insurance claim would be civil law. So therefore, there's a different burden of proof and so on. But to what extent do the insurance companies and the PAs kind of work together in harmony on this, or is that something that is an opportunity to be explored so that the advice is kind of consistent throughout?
And I think this is an opportunity to be explored, really. So again, back in my Office of Product Safety and Standards days, we weren't really interested in what I would call the sort of the knock-on or the sort of ancillary stuff. So it's evident to me that working more commercially, that businesses are interested in insurance premiums. So that they're paying they're paying a high amount for product liability insurance or their professional indemnity insurance. Suddenly, if you've got a PA relationship and you've got assured advice, that really, from an insurance point of view, should count for something.
Yeah.
Now, that isn't current. Those conversations, I don't think, are currently happening. I don't think there's a real incentive from the primary authorities' point of view. They're not operating in a commercial world. So I think there are a number of opportunities there. There's a similar one with regards to procurement teams. So there's a number of things that aren't formally covered by the scheme, but just the concept of earned recognition. Ultimately, businesses should be thinking, why have we gone down this particular route? Yes, enforced, the traditional, we won't receive any enforcement action, etc., is a traditional view. But ultimately, I think it's broader than that, there's a number of other conversations where businesses should say, will this affect our insurance premium? And they should be reaching out to their brokers, their underwriters, to say, we've got this, we've got this piece of paper. What does it mean to you? Does it give us any recognition, or more importantly, does it give us a discount with regards to our premium?
And it should, I think, certainly in theory anyway, and particularly with what's happening in the insurance market at the moment, where we're seeing rates going up because the market's hardening, and insurers are being a lot more picky and choosy about who they're working with, and what they want to see is that their potential clients are, as close to best in class as they can be when it comes to managing their risk. So anything like this, which is proof that the client is taking risks seriously and diligently, and working with such luminaries as local authorities to kind of get it right. Well, that should theoretically count for a lot, maybe in some cases.
Yeah, and ultimately, they need to be looking at active partnerships. So I think it needs to be twofold. It's not just a case of having a partnership. It needs to be having the conversations and having the advice. So going back to the health and safety, slips, trips and falls procedure, that's the type of thing that they need to be presenting to the underwriters. That's the type of detail. You might tier it in some respects, that they'll get some discount for having a relationship. But I think the biggest discount, and what you really want, is a case of, we've got an active partnership, and here's a copy of the assured advice. You work out what discount you'll give me on the back of that.
Either a discount or better terms when it comes to claims. So maybe without this, your excess is £1,000, whereas with it, your excess is £10,000. So in other words, you're reducing the risk that the client is going to have to put their hands in their pockets for for any claims, because you as the insurer perceive that because they've got this advice, they're going to have fewer claims happening against them, which obviously is how it should work.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say at the moment, no business is particularly pushing that. They're just not aware that that's an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I think quite a few of the people that will be watching this are going to be involved in that insurance and brokerage world. So I'm sure you might get some phone calls or some emails as a result of this to have start having those conversations, which would be great, because I think it's a way of holistically solving the problem. And everybody, I think it's people sometimes assume that insurers want there to be claims. That's actually far from the truth. Insurers, what insurers want is, here's your price, and it's based on one claim a year. Ideally, we want 0 claims a year, because then we make a profit. If we have 2 claims a year, we make a loss. So it's in everybody's interest to try and work together to solve this, I think.
Yeah, and just to give you a bit of feedback, every conversation I've had with insurance brokers they've been extremely receptive. They didn't, generally speaking, they didn't know anything about the scheme, and then you've gone into some detail to say this is what it means. It's an independent sign-off process. Here's a copy of the VAT. They've been like, wow, I'm amazed. We're scratching around trying to set these rates, etc., and we've got something here that we can actually work with. Yeah,
that makes sense. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but how does it actually work? So let's say somebody's watching this and they're a business owner or somebody senior in a business, and they think, oh, this sounds interesting. Obviously, then come to you for advice. But in terms of how does the process look like from we decide we want to explore this through to it's all signed, sealed, and delivered, and we've got that piece of paper, all those pieces of paper in our hands?
So I think the first consideration, they've decided to go down the route of PA. That's for them. The second consideration is, who should we go with from a PA point of view? What I haven't mentioned is, historically, definitely early on in the scheme, the default was that you would go with your local authority.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a sort of overspill, really, of home authority. So generally speaking, the business defaulted to, I'm in Newcastle, I'll go with Newcastle.
Yeah.
What we found what the office have found over a period of time is that's not the case at all. So you'll find examples where, I still think this is the case, geography isn't important. You really, especially at this moment in time where I'm sat in Manchester, you're sat in the home counties or wherever exactly you are, I think most of it can be done done remotely. So really you should be looking for expertise, you should be looking for flexibility, you should be looking for resilience, etc. Then there's a nomination process, so that's relatively straightforward. Again, if you know what to a certain degree, if you know what you're doing, there's there's two different routes. There's a direct partnership, and then there's what's called a coordinated partnership.
Mm-hmm.
So the coordinated partnership came in within the last sort of 5 years, where there was a recognition that smaller businesses who were part of trade associations effectively weren't covered. So typically, all the problems we've identified with regards to single point of contact, inconsistency, really lent itself to large, multiple-sided operations. So the early adopters were B&Q, Asda, etc. So there's a conversation about whether you want a direct or coordinated, or indeed you could have both. And then ultimately the partnership goes live. You can generate a certificate. And ultimately, then it's about getting down to business, deciding what you want to do as a partnership, and then say, the first thing we want to look at is the procedure for slips, trips, and falls, and we're going to agree to do that in the next 3 months or whatever else.
Yeah.
to a certain degree, from my own point of view, I can be involved in all those bits of the process,
Yeah.
or I can be involved in just just one of them. It just really depends on the business. Some people, as you know, some businesses have got compliance people already in place. Others don't have that. They literally have the CEO and not much else. So it's really dependent on the individual business.
Okay. And perhaps it's hard to say, but are we talking thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions to get this sort of thing set up?
I would say small thousands. I would say.
Yeah,
again,
every business is different, of course, but
yeah, and some businesses want they quite like a retainer, so they don't want necessarily to deal with the PA on a day-to-day basis. They don't want to meet them monthly and quarterly, etc., which again makes sense. If you're if you own a series of gyms, do you want to be doing that? It's probably not the best use of your time. So say some clients have gone down the retainer route, which I'm obviously happy to
help with.
do.
And from the local authority perspective, unless this has changed, when I was looking at this in more detail a few years ago, the rates that they were charging for their time were not commercial rates as such. So it's, you can obviously go and get a health and safety or compliance consultant to put together a process for you and a policy, but the charge that they would levy for that is a lot more than the local authority would charge you to get to review that and sign it off. I think that's right.
Yeah, so there's some variation with regards to cost recovery and the PA's hourly rate. I think typically you're looking at a range of about £60 an hour to top probably about £100 an hour.
Okay.
And that generally stacks up that again, if you're based in you're a PA based in Westminster, the centre of London, then obviously your costs are significantly higher than, funnily enough, than the Newcastle example.
Yeah.
So as a general rule, I would make the comment that most businesses aren't cost sensitive. That's and it would be slightly worrying conversation that they would choose a PA solely on cost. Now, again, obviously, all businesses want to drive costs down wherever, but there's a time and place for bargaining, and that time and place isn't sat in front of a potential PA. They're not going to budge on their price. So that, to me, in the criteria conversation, should be fairly low down on the business's criteria, but at the end of the day, it's the business's criteria. But I'd try and discourage them to focus on that. Ultimately, typically, they're only going to spend a couple of £1,000 a year for the partnership. Depends how active it is, but it's not massive money for the benefits that they're receiving.
Yeah, well, that's it, because just think of again, we're going back to it again, but if you're based in London and you're having to go up to Newcastle to do meetings as part of an investigation, you're spending £300 potentially on just on the train ticket each time you go, never mind your time in a hotel and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of savings there, and that's only on the direct costs of any investigations, and plus there's all this insurance angle, and also it's actually just about being best in class and wanting to do things and know you're doing things and be able to look yourself in the mirror and know you've done everything you can to protect your business and your staff and your clients, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's generally the feedback that you get from the businesses, that ultimately gives them, say, that bit of assurance.
Yeah, no, perfect. Great. Well, Dave, thanks very much for your time. I think that's been really useful. Anybody that hasn't heard of this before, I think will be thinking, oh, wow, that's something we should be looking into. So with that in mind, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you, and you can help to guide them and work with them through that process?
I think generally speaking, email's good. I'm
Okay.
fairly active
Yeah.
on LinkedIn. I'm happy to I'm happy to take messages on there. But yeah, generally speaking, an email's always always preferred.
All right. Well, I'll stick your email up so people can find it easily, and perhaps a link to your LinkedIn as well. And anything that I forgot to ask you before we sign off that is a really critical point about PA that we haven't touched on, or would you think we've covered most of it?
I suppose interesting. We haven't really talked about the pandemic at all. We've sort of skirted. That's perhaps been the elephant in the room. I'm finding that businesses need assurance more than ever in these current in the current climate. So, ultimately decisions are being made. In some circumstances, they've been made quite quickly by the business community. So I would encourage, wherever possible, that businesses think about where they're getting their advice from. And in this respect, I do think PA gives you that that extra assurance where ultimately there's other providers of advice that don't give you the same benefit.
Yeah, that is a very good point actually, and I think I'm just a bit worn down by talking about coronavirus.
Possibly.
In my world, for example, around hygiene, the hygiene aspects of this, and in terms of cleaning and disinfection and stuff. I mean, there's so much bad advice that we're seeing from cleaning companies and various other people that clients are probably following because they're a cleaning company, they've got a good website, they must know what they're talking about. So yeah, you're right. I think now more than ever, because there are going to be insurance claims coming out of this. Clearly there are going to be a requirement for enforcement coming out of it. So yeah, absolutely. I think probably now more than ever it's important to get this right.
Yeah, so there's a few things. Clearly businesses are pivoting, and there's some examples where it's clear that they're pivoting into industries that they know nothing about. So that is going to cause clearly a problem from an enforcement point of view. So we've got deep cleaning is a good example. PPE is another example. That ultimately I would be encouraging businesses to reach out to the PAs and use them to give them the answers that they want.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Well, Dave, thanks again for your time, and we'll look forward to catching up whenever we're able to do so again, and having a coffee or something a bit stronger, perhaps.
Something stronger.
Yeah. All
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers.